So welcome everybody to the meeting. If you could turn your mics and cameras off, that would be fantastic, so we don't have any interruptions. And we're going to have questions at the end. So if you've got any questions, you can pop them in there's a little comments chat down the bottom. Pop your questions in there, and we'll open it up to verbal questions if time allows. And we're recording the meeting. So I will hand over to Megan, who's going to give you a short introduction.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Sarah. I thought I would just give everybody a very brief background of where this project's come from, and then hand you over to Kate for all the goody details. So this piece of work was proposed by Auckland Council's Environmental Services team and funded by the Rodney Local Board. The work was initiated from recognising the extensive and complex range of projects in the area from local and national government, iwi, community and other agencies as well. Also the interests, the powerful mahi of the community, and also, of course, the ecological values in this part of Auckland. The aim of the project was to pull together information from a range of sources to produce a prioritisation document for conservation activities that could be used to guide a range of stakeholders. To do this, Council engaged Boffa Miskell, and presenting tonight is Kate Heaphy. And I'd really just like to take a moment to acknowledge and congratulate Kate because the Ecological Connectivity Roadmap actually won the Resource Management Law Association Technical Documentation Award and was also a finalist in the New Zealand Spatial Excellence Award for Community Impact. So that was, just outstanding work. So very proud there. But I'll pass over to Kate now. Thank you, Kate, and ngā mihi.
Kia ora, Megan. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Mawatamonga, ko Waroa te awa, ko ngā tahu te iwi, ko Toronga Moana aho. Engari, kei te noho au ki Otutahi. Ko Heaphy toko whanau, ko Kate toko inga he kaihauropi aho. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us tonight. Firstly, I do apologise about my lack of video. My camera has decided to not work tonight. However, if that is the only technical hitch we have other than temperamental links, I'll be quite happy. So as Megan was saying, my name is Kate and I've been an ecologist at Boffa Miskell for 3.5 years. I'm originally from Tauranga, but studied ecology at the universities of Otago and then up in Auckland. So my background is mostly in mammalian predator control. So half my job involves developing strategic and operational pest control plans for landowners right up to landscape scale predator-free 2050 projects. And the other half of my job is research and development of new control and monitoring tools, including species-specific AI traps, smart AI cameras, long life lures, but that's a talk for another day. So this evening, I'm going to run you through the development of the Ecological Connectivity Roadmap for Rodney East and how to use it and interpret it for your own projects. So I'll start by sharing my screen and hopefully you can all see that now. So hopefully you've all had a chance to look through the recommendations and explore the maps a bit, but all good if not. If you aren't familiar, the roadmap is presented as an online story map, which is available at this link here and is on the Auckland Council website. However, if you do prefer to use a written report, there is a report in PDF format with PDF maps here. So first, let's start with a definition. In technical speak, ecological connectivity is the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement among habitat patches and spatially distributed resources. In simple words, ecological connectivity is simply how easy movement is across a landscape. So connectivity is important for our native species, including both flora and fauna, as well as natural processes such as water flow and nutrient cycles. Which brings us to why this roadmap was developed. So funded by the Rodney Local Board, as Megan was saying, and developed in collaboration with Auckland Council and many of the community groups to help support the highly engaged network of community conservation groups throughout Rodney East. So my role was providing the technical advice to analyse the existing and potential connectivity in the region. The main purpose of this roadmap is therefore to identify gaps and evaluate opportunities to protect, enhance, connect and extend existing valuable habitats to create a functional network of green spaces at a landscape scale across Rodney East. So the ultimate goal is to enable communities such as yourself and council to work cohesively to achieve effective conservation outcomes. So there's 4 key objectives that we had. The first is to map and describe areas of high ecological value. The second is to identify gaps and evaluate opportunities to protect, enhance, connect and extend existing habitat patches. The third is to prioritise areas for management. And the fourth is the ultimate goal of enabling everyone to work together cohesively to achieve conservation outcomes at a landscape scale. So we're really talking about the combined benefit of all these conservation groups working together and filling in all the gaps to form a network of conservation activity across the region. It is important to note that we focused on 2 ecosystem types as a starting point, as this kind of analysis has not really been done in New Zealand before. So these ecosystems were forest and wetlands, and I do acknowledge there are other ecosystem types that are also threatened and would benefit from conservation action, such as coastal, estuarine, freshwater ecosystems. But this roadmap is just being provided for forest and wetlands at this stage, so very much a terrestrial focus. One of the great things about these story maps is that there are many interactive features such as this slider, which shows the current ecosystem extent and the historic or potential ecosystem extent. This demonstrates why enhancing connectivity is so important, especially in urban areas, and can show community who is not as aware of these issues as others. So it's a really useful communication tool that you can use to help explain how your project fits into the bigger picture of Restore Rodney East. So this is quite a lot of information and technical detail. So this section provides a brief user guide which directs you on how to use the strategy on the ground. There are 4 key ways you can use the strategy. One is to identify areas for conservation action. The second is to identify actions in a particular high value area. The third is to identify the surrounding conservation groups and see where the gaps between the groups are and facilitate the communication between the groups to see whether you can expand or help fill in those gaps in the network. And the fourth is to aid funding applications and increase support and awareness of your conservation projects. You are more than welcome to take wording from the strategy and take screenshots of the maps, anything that will help you develop and also communicate your goals and the benefits of the project at a more landscape scale level. For example, you can use them to show how undertaking pest control in a backyard or in a small local reserve can be part of a much bigger picture that benefits biodiversity across the region. So now let's jump straight into the maps shown in the interactive map viewer, which is this tab here, and I have preloaded it in a new window. This interactive map contains all of the layers used or produced in the analysis, which you can select here on the left. To develop the roadmap, we undertook a formal connectivity analysis using a software called Linkage Mapper, I'll briefly explain the methods that we used, and don't worry if it gets a bit technical, but I thought it would be helpful just to explain how we built the connectivity model and the inputs to create the model for those of you who are interested, and hopefully it will give you a better idea of what the outputs mean. When I talk about inputs and outputs, I'm just referring to the data we put into the model, which are the inputs, and the outputs are the end products or model that the connectivity software linkage mapper created. So to create the model for each ecosystem type, that is forests and wetlands, we selected one species to represent that ecosystem. This is because we were interested in functional connectivity and not just structural connectivity. The big difference is that functional connectivity incorporates a biological element into the analysis compared to structural connectivity, which is just analyzes the placement of habitats throughout the landscape. For forests, we used kereru as the model species, and for wetlands, we used matuku, or the Australasian bittern. The idea of these umbrella species, as we call them, is that if we undertake conservation actions to protect the umbrella species, many other species in that ecosystem and that ecosystem itself will also be protected and will benefit, hence the idea of an umbrella. The selection of these umbrella species was based on ecological justification and what species were important to the local community, which we assessed via several local online surveys, and I'm sure some of you filled those out. So let's start with the forest connectivity analysis. This layer here is the core habitat areas for kereru. So this is one of the two main inputs into the model. These mostly show areas of forests or preferred habitat for kereru, which we created based on the underlying land cover. The underlying land cover we took from the New Zealand Land Cover database, and we integrated it with Singer's Ecosystem Types of Auckland, if any of you are familiar with that layer, which is a little bit more finer scale to get more detail for each pixel and what land cover might be in each pixel. The second important input into Linkage Mapper is the kereru resistance raster, which is this layer here. So the resistance shows how easy or difficult it is for kereru to move through the landscape. The light areas are where it is easy, and the dark areas are where it is more difficult. And you can see through here, we've incorporated the underlying land cover, which is essentially the inverse of the core habitats. So if you have a big chunk of forest, it is a lot easier for a kereru to move through compared to the farmland when there's no suitable habitat or likely food sources. We also included different landscape features in this resistance raster, such as roads, and you can see the effect that these have on this layer. So this doesn't matter too much for the management recommendations, it's just to help you understand how the model was created. So if we turn on our core habitat areas again, one of the main outputs of the model is the kereru least cost paths. So this shows the potential linkages between core habitats based on that underlying resistance raster. So if we zoom in a bit, you can see that these lines are not straight. So the software is calculating the path of least resistance between the two habitat patches. So this kind of helps explain why these lines are not straight. The yellow lines show potential linkages that are within a specified maximum dispersal distance of kereru. We used about 4.5 kilometres based on literature. And these red lines are linkages that are beyond that threshold. The threshold that we used, about 4.5 km, was the maximum pasture crossing distance of a keraru. And we all know that keraru are very strong flyers. They've crossed the Fovo Strait. They can obviously fly a lot further, but the aim is to really make it easy for them and facilitate connectivity, not just for keraru, but other species as well, and of the forest ecosystems. Hence, this is quite a useful comparison for undertaking management actions, whether you want to focus on enhancing these pink linkages by putting in extra habitat patches along that linkage, for example, or whether it's worth focusing on these existing linkages that you could more easily enhance. We'll get to the management actions in a moment. Now, obviously, birds do not fly in straight lines, so we created buffers around each linkage to encourage conservation action to be undertaken within a zone to provide pathways for birds to move between forest habitat patches. Now, this is not to say that other areas would benefit from conservation action. It's just a prioritization tool to help people see where they could undertake actions that would be of most benefit and really link it up across the landscape. Other layers worth mentioning are the other suitable habitats, which are these small ones here. This is mostly due to computational limitations. So what I mean by that is there are a lot of habitat patches of forests throughout the Rodney East landscape. It's a really large area and it is quite fragmented. So in order to select the largest habitat patches and use those as a prioritization, we selected those that are less than about 2 hectares and we've included them as an important management area, but have not included them in the analysis, just because it would probably take the software 2 to 3 weeks to run each iteration of the model. The core habitat connections are these pale white dashed lines. These just show the potential connections between the centre of each core habitat and without the influence of this resistance raster underneath. So this doesn't really have much implication from a management perspective. It's just interesting to see the potential connections without the influence of the underlying land cover and see how many there could be compared to how many there actually are that was created by the model. Finally, the last layer is this CWD, which stands for cost weighted distance. Now this is the accumulated movement difficulty of a keraru as it moves from one habitat patch to another. So as you can see, this area has a very high resistance shown by the red in the middle. It is far away from a core habitat, and that is also useful to take into consideration in the management recommendations, as this can be a focus of additional conservation action by creating additional habitat or even enhancing the size of these smaller other suitable habitats to create a larger habitat patch that is capable of hosting a lot more species, a lot more biodiversity. So if we zoom out, this forms the overall connectivity model for forests in Rodney East. Now for the management recommendations, we divided the area up into 3 different zones, which we called the Northern, Central and Southern zones, because it is a very large area. And as you can see, the connectivity patterns in each zone are quite different. So the Southern zone The management recommendation here is to protect and enhance the existing habitat patches. You can see we already have a high number of existing core habitats. We have a lot of these yellow linkages, not too many red ones. So these habitat patches are quite close together. And we don't have a lot of red in that CWD layer. So a lot of the landscape is of reasonably low resistance. So it's already easy for a keraru to move through. However, the management focus is therefore on protecting and enhancing and undertaking actions such as predator control to make those habitats as safe and connected as possible. So the priority areas we've recommended are focusing on the areas of core habitats, followed by the other small, other suitable habitats in that zone. In the central zone, you can see we have already quite a strong linkage east to west, and we've got the linkages running to the north and to the south. So for the central zone, the recommendations are focusing again on the core habitats and then on the current and potential linkages between the core habitats. So looking at ways to get this already existing connectivity that's running east to west and extend that north to south to link up these zones in a much more cohesive way. In the northern zone, you can see we've got a lot of red in that CWD. We don't have a lot of existing core habitat patches. So the focus is really on creating new habitat and enhancing within these red CWD areas to create additional habitat and really reduce the resistance of the landscape. One other benefit of the interactive map viewer is that you can click on any of these features and it comes up with a pop-up box as you would have seen. So if I click on the central habitat patch, it comes up with a habitat ID. This is just a random number to help you communicate which habitat patches you were talking about. They are all numbered. And it also gives you the number of connections. As this is a large central habitat patch, you can see it has a very high number of connections compared to a smaller one which only has 5. If resources are limited, speaking from a very landscape scale perspective, one of the recommendations is to focus on the habitat patches with a higher number of connections first. The other way you can find out information is by clicking on this down arrow in the legend, and it will show you what the features on the map are representing. So this is essentially your legend on the map, and you can see that the core areas are color-coded from the lowest number of connections up to 7 and above, just to make it visually easy to see which are the most important core habitats in terms of number of connections. So that brings us to the end of the forest management layers, and I will quickly show you what the wetland connectivity model looks like. So as I said, we used the matuku or bitten for the connectivity analysis of wetlands. And as you can see, wetlands are very small and fragmented across Rodney East. So it is a very stark difference in pattern compared to the forest. The least cost paths are similarly very fragmented, and the software really struggled to even connect them up. So, as expected, there's quite a lot of red and yellow on this cost-weighted distance, the accumulated cost of travelling from one wetland to another. So what we did is connect them up with what we call these connectivity corridors. So this is kind of a hypothetical way of connecting the wetlands based on that cost-weighted distance layer. So you can see we've created a web that follows those blue areas, the buffers around each core habitat. And this is the final model. So you can see it is very different from the forest connectivity model. And the recommendation for management here is to focus on protecting and enhancing the remaining wetland habitats. It is quite hard to create additional wetland habitat. And so it's really focusing on what we already have and not losing any more. Now, there are a lot of other layers that you can choose to add on to the map viewer depending on what you're interested in. We've got road infrastructure, we've got the significant ecological areas, we've got biodiversity focus areas, which are Auckland Council's already existing priorities. We've got dot conservation areas, and of course, importantly, the community groups, areas of interest, and work locations. Again, if you could click on any of these, it pops up with who the group is, a little bit about what they're doing, and whether it's predator control, fencing, weed control, community outreach. So hopefully it just facilitates the communication between all the amazing groups already in action. So now we're going to jump back to the story map and go through the management actions section. So the rest of this section provides a bit of general information on how to undertake the recommended actions in the priority areas. And as you can see, we've divided the forest ecosystems up into those 3 zones. And this table just summarizes what those priority actions are. Remember, you can also go back to that interactive map, click on the zone, and it will come up with that pop-up box, or you can just refer to this table. And then we've also got the priority actions for those areas. So the helpful part of this table is you can see which layers to click on the interactive map, depending on which zone you're in. So for example, if you're in the northern zone and you want to see what the priority areas are, you would click on the CWD layer as your first point of call, and then look at the red areas. You can also look at the linkages on the least cost paths layer and where those yellow and pink linkages are. Then you can look at the priority actions for those areas, and a little bit of background information on undertaking those actions is also provided in this section a bit further down. We've divided that information into the following topics. We've got how to enhance existing habitat patches, how to improve connectivity between patches, that's if you're looking at enhancing those linkages, improving connectivity on private land. This can be quite a challenge for community groups, and to get such a large landscape scale project, getting everyone on board can be quite difficult. So there's some advice on how to do that effectively. A bit of information on undertaking predator control as a bit of a starting point. Opportunities to utilise transport infrastructure as greenways, and some guidance on how to plan projects at the landscape scale effectively. We've also got these maps here, which just show the overall connectivity models in case you are getting a bit overwhelmed by the number of layers in the interactive map. It is all spelled out in this story map. If you click on the button down here, it brings up the legend and it will show you exactly what you're looking at on the map. You can also expand these maps in a new window if you want to open it up and zoom into your area of interest. So as I said, The rest of the section just provides some background information on how to undertake each of those recommended actions in each area. So now I'm going to jump to the next section, which is connectivity analysis. This is just a background if you're interested or need a resource to refer to. It covers information like the definition of ecological connectivity, why it's important, and information on the umbrella species and the assumptions and limitations of the model. Like any modelling, there are assumptions and limitations. In particular, there are areas outside of the boundary of Rodney East that may be important to take into consideration, such as the islands in the Hauraki Gulf. There are other ecosystems that would also benefit from conservation action. There are other species with different connectivity requirements, such as invertebrates and lizards, which may be the focus of some projects. These models do not take into account ongoing pressures such as climate change or potential land use change, as this data is not overly reliable at the moment for this particular use. So it's just increasing the amount of uncertainty in the model. So this is really a snapshot of connectivity at the moment and where the connectivity actions could be undertaken. And finally, it's important to note that the limitations of any spatial modelling is only as good as the quality of the input data. So in particular, this is about the scale. It is undertaken at a landscape scale. So as you zoom in, you just need to be mindful of the accuracy of the model and use your own good ecological judgment about whether it's appropriate to undertake the actions in a particular area. If you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the layers in that interactive map, feel free to come down to here. This is the summary of results, and it lists the key inputs and outputs and what maps are available on the interactive map viewer, and a bit of a definition and what that layer is showing. So we've got a bit of background on each of the umbrella species. This is quite important to make sure that you do take an ecological approach to interpreting the model. And we've also got the key layers for each ecosystem and its umbrella species here. So you may find this a little bit easier to use just to get your head around how the model is structured and the key layers to look at. We did do an example analysis on P Waka Waka, or the fantail. It is a 4x4 kilometre square grid, and this is just to show the fine scale connectivity that it can occur at a more zoomed in level for a species that does not have the same flying capabilities as a bird such as the kerero. So it really depends on the species that you are really focused on in your conservation project and what your goals are. We've also included a map of Peka Peka Tauroa, the bat habitat. We chose not to undertake a full connectivity analysis on this data because we did not have enough confidence in our understanding of bats' movements through the landscape in the Auckland region. So instead, we've just provided the habitat of kind of the forest ecosystems and areas with potentially mature tall trees as a bit of a starting point and a reminder to always consider the outcomes of your conservation project. We also have a list of all the different layers that we used in developing the core habitats and resistance raster here. Right, so at the end, we've just got a library of useful links. Hopefully these will be helpful for you and other community members when undertaking some of these actions, just have them in one place. And we've also got a bit of a glossary. There is quite a lot of technical language in here. Hopefully I haven't confused you too much tonight, but if you do feel confused, you can just come to the glossary as well. And finally, there is the Add a Project. So if there are any community groups that become established, please direct them to Auckland Council's Community Group Survey that's hosted on the Auckland Council's Te Aki Tamaki Makaurau Conservation website, and it will be loaded into that database, and that can give you access to a lot of resources to help the community group get off the ground. So the key messages are really, this is the first step and a snapshot of connectivity in Rodney East, and hopefully a bit of guidance about where you can go at a very landscape scale. And it's really aiming to increase the environmental literacy of community who aren't so aware of environmental issues. If you are reaching out to the likes of landowners, neighbours, and getting people involved in your own project. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we've got some time if anyone has any questions. Colin, did you have any ready?
Yes, look, thanks very, very much for that report, Kate. I can see many uses for the resource that you have produced. And for me and a couple of groups that I have an interest in, we can be seen as being part of a larger landscape plan, should such one be originated in the areas in which we operate. But I've got a couple of questions here that I'd like to ask you. First from Sarah, is this model ongoing and is it being added to?
Excellent question. We have had a lot of conversations with Auckland Council and the local board throughout the development of this project. At this stage, it will not be updated. It is just a snapshot, but there is definitely scope to review it and add to it in future.
We can use all or any part of your report as a resource for any application for finance we're making on behalf of any environmental group. Is that accurate, what I said there?
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's really a resource for all of the community groups out there to help them communicate what their conservation goals are. And there's a PDF report that you can take text out of, and you can reference the interactive map viewer, take screenshots, help gain support for your projects by showing how your project fits into the large landscape scale picture. So yes, please feel free to use it for funding applications and general presentations.
Okay, this one's from Shelley. Is there an overlay of where the kiriru actually are?
I really wish there was. One of the recommendations in particular for the wetland model is it would benefit from on-the-ground validation. So one of the potential future avenues, a particular research avenue, is to look at how accurate that model is based on kiriru movement data. So that is an idea in the back of our minds that we'd love to pursue, but not at this stage.
Another matter, although you didn't specifically mention climate action, is recent council reports indicate how important forest ecosystems are to combat the climate crisis we're facing.
Yes.
What is your attitude to the need to protect the umbrella species, the kiriru, in areas where they breed, particularly in parks? What type of protection should we be giving the kiriru?
Wow, there's so many parts to that comment. Oh, it's fantastic. I'll start with the climate change aspect, because that's something that I'm very, very passionate about. We were not able to incorporate the climate change layers. We don't really know how to do this. There are examples of it being done overseas, and this is something that I really wanted to pursue. So I've got a research grant from Boffa Miskell, some internal company funding, to undertake that as a bit of a research project. So we might be able to incorporate climate change in the future based on those overseas examples. Obviously, the New Zealand context is very, very different. We're operating at a very different scale. We've got different ecosystems, we've got different species. The effects of climate change are going to be very different. So watch this space regarding that. However, connectivity itself, increasing connectivity, is one of the most cited ways of increasing ecosystem resilience, and is a very well recognised internationally mitigation method of combating climate change, because it allows for species range shifts. It reduces the pressure on a particular species. For example, if you've got a really high resistance in the landscape and it is very hard for a species to move from one area to the other, adding the compounding impacts of climate change, urban intensification, pollution, any of those, it's really just making it as easy as possible for the species by reducing one of those pressures, and that's combating the ecosystem fragmentation. So in terms of what we can do for the kiraru, one of the big ones is predator control. Very easy way to decrease the resistance, especially at a landscape scale. It makes it a lot safer. You can protect those core areas. That's one of the key pressures for a lot of our native species. You can have the buffer zones around those core habitats, which is particularly important for our wide-ranging predators, such as mustelids. Does that kind of answer the question? It was a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, I think personally, I think, yes, it does answer the question thoroughly. Thanks
Excellent.
very much. Another question here, Kate, from Alan France. Thanks, Kate, for this. Is this work getting published in scientific journals?
I'm working on it. Not at the moment. It's very, very hard to fit in publication. I would love to, but at the moment, the main thing is having it out there, published, ready for the community to use. I have given talks at several conferences, including the New Zealand Ecological Society conference last year. So it is a published abstract. But other than that, watch the space.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And another comments, very nice comments here from Shelley. Kate, I am in awe. What an amazing piece of work. So she then continues, the New Zealand Bird Atlas has a lot of spatial data on all species. Not sure how we can get it out, but I'm sure we can.
Yes, there's a lot of different databases that we can use, and we did look at getting known locations. I think there's a bit of information in the PDF report from memory, but there's things like eBird, iNaturalist, and we gathered some of that data to validate those core habitats. We just felt it was getting a little bit technically complicated, so I don't know if we went into too much detail in actually presenting that information.
Just one final question from me, Kate, and then we can open it up. How important is it for there to be some consistency of predator control across the Rodney East area in terms of protecting the kiriru?
I suppose it depends what you mean in terms of consistency. For the wide-ranging predators such as your mustelids and, dare I say it, feral cats, it's really, really important that there is predator control right across the area. A lot of those species can move massive distances. You know, we're talking 50, 60 kilometres for dispersing juveniles. So having predator control targeting those key predators is really important. How that control is undertaken, there is a lot of different ways, you know, whether it's trapping or toxic baiting or live capture trapping. So there's a lot of flexibility in how it can be undertaken. But yeah, super important to really reduce that predation pressure.
Okay. Another question here, Kate, from John C. Kirrirua frugivores. Other birds have other preferred foods. Is there an overlay specifying preferred plants for regeneration?
Yes, very good point. No, there is not in this roadmap. However, I'm sure you could find that information somewhere. You might have to dig through the literature a bit to find it. One of the criteria for selecting a umbrella species was actually a species that would provide a particular ecosystem service. And, you know, as Kirrirua frugivores, they have a massive role in distributing some of our native seeds that a lot of our other birds are not able to disperse. So in terms of like an ecosystem umbrella species that will, if you protect that species, you'd also protect the ecosystem. Kirrirua were an excellent choice. Ideally, you would layer up lots of different species and you'd have birds that drink nectar or insectivores. But in the interest of time and budget, we've just focused on the one. But yes, if there are other resources that you do want to overlay and use this roadmap alongside, do please feel free.
Okay, that's it for the questions in the chat area, Kate. I can leave it open. Hold on, I've got another one now. Oh yes, no, I can leave it open now for those who would like to ask you direct by way of unmuting and having a chat. So thank you heaps, Kate. Very good indeed.
No worries.
I'll just start there. It's probably a nice time. Everyone could probably turn back on their videos to make this a little bit more personalised as well.
Again, I apologise that my video is not working.
That's okay. That was fantastic, Kate. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for that information. But yeah, has anybody else got any questions or comments? Feel free to turn your mics back off.
Hi Kate, I'm Shelley. We've got some amazing local sanctuaries on Haturua Otoi and Tawharanui, Shakespeare and Turituri Matangi. Can we model the likelihood of species arriving between those sanctuaries into our new mainland predator reduced areas?
Yes, I suppose you could. You can just about model anything these days. I suppose one of the cool things about the roadmap is it is looking at those source populations without getting into too much detail into source sink population dynamics, because that can change over time, and some of that data is just introducing a few too many variables when this is quite a new software for New Zealand. But in terms of interpreting that model, it's definitely worth taking into consideration where those source populations are and then providing the connectivity away from them, just to make it easy for them to spread out into the landscape.
Nice, because I think that translocations especially, they don't necessarily stay. So,
yes.
So yeah, I think that it's my dream that when these animals escape, that they might actually be able to thrive outside of those sanctuaries.
Yeah, we really need to get the predator control and enhance those ecosystem habitat patches to create the environment that kind of entices them out and make it safe for them. And that's kind of the whole point of enhancing connectivity, is you're taking all these different concepts of habitat enhancement and enrichment, and then providing that across the landscape.
Awesome. And if there's no one else wanting to ask questions, I've got another one.
Fire away.
Yeah. So the boundaries of restore Rodney East don't go coast to coast, even though we're on a really narrow piece of island. And I think that we perhaps collectively could fix that, because it's all still part of the Rodney Local Board. And if we're going to truly think landscape scale, then we should be making a stand, as it were. So do you think that that your model supports that idea?
Well, the model itself is just focused on Rodney East, and yes, it is a very legal boundary, and birds do not stick to legal boundaries. So as an ecologist and from an ecological perspective, it does make sense to have it running east to west, in my opinion, potentially not in the opinion of others' political influences. But again, it's also about taking it in bite-sized chunks. So I think it would be very valuable to have a very, very large focus, and then focusing it on Rodney East as kind of a starting point, and then working it out. And, you know, there's initiatives like Predator Free 2050, which is a whole national. So, I mean, start at the national and then kind of go down and then back up.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No worries.
If I can be of assistance there, Shelley, when Fran, Tim, Sarah and myself sat down and drafted out the Constitution, we decided to give ourselves a little bit of freedom in terms of the definition of Rodney East. So we've defined Rodney East as the eastern portion of the Rodney Local Board area of Auckland, or such area as the committee may from time to time determine. So we've taken a fairly robust approach, because that's the reality. We are from east to west, or from west to east. So, but it also gives the committee control.
Excellent. Well done.
Just add in there as well, Colin. Shelley, I just realised before I didn't actually introduce myself as being Auckland Council. I'm with the Natural Environment Delivery Team based in Orewa, and happy to chat anytime, Shelley, with some of the other work that we've got going on, or what other opportunities there might be for that sort of east-west linkage.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions, anyone? I think that might be about it, Kate. So
that was right on time.
Yeah, so it's been an awesome presentation. On behalf of Restore Rodney East, I'd like to thank you so much for your time, not just tonight, but preparing for this with us, the meetings we've held ahead of this, and all the input and conversations we've had leading up to it, to make it a presentation. Yeah, that's just been great. And I can see so many of the people that are here tonight are very much key members of organisations across Restore Rodney East. So it's fantastic. So thank you so much for your time, and to everybody that came along to the event.
Yes, I'd also like to thank everyone else who listened tonight. I'm amazed at all of the incredible mahi you've all been doing in the area, and just keep it up and keep fighting. It's amazing, and it's been a pleasure working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Kate. Well done.
Thank you, Kate.